Okay, so get ready because we're going to be diving deep into a topic that is both terrifying and honestly pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Serial killers in India. And
Mhm.
obviously, if you're listening to this, you probably have a bit of a taste for the dark side of things.
Right.
And this research paper that we're looking at today, Silent Beast Around You, an overview of serial killers in India,
Yes.
really delivers.
It
I
does.
mean, this is a really interesting look into the minds of these real life monsters, and I
Yeah.
think it's important for us to state right up front. We're not trying to sensationalize this.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
goal is not to glorify these acts,
No. Right.
but to really try to understand, what makes these people tick.
Yeah.
Like what drives a person to do these horrible things.
It's a question that people have been trying to figure out for centuries.
Yeah.
Criminologists, psychologists, and this paper is really interesting because it takes it from the specific cultural context of India,
Where until recently, the idea of a serial killer was almost unthinkable.
yeah, it's like you said, it was almost something that felt like it was straight out of like a Hollywood movie,
Right.
not something that you would actually expect to find in your own backyard.
Yeah,
But the reality is, serial killers exist everywhere.
they do.
And understanding their motivations, their methods, is really crucial no matter where you are in the world.
Absolutely. And that's one of the first things that this paper does is it kind of lays out,
Yeah.
what is the criteria for what makes a serial killer different than another type of multiple murderer.
Okay.
Because it's not just about the body count, right?
Yeah.
It's about the pattern, the
Mhm.
psychology behind it.
So what sets them apart then?
The key is the cooling off period.
Okay.
A serial killer doesn't just snap and go on a rampage.
Hmm.
They plan.
Right?
They strategize. They often blend back into society for months, sometimes even years.
Oh, wow. Before they strike again, and it's this very calculated, almost ritualistic
Yeah.
nature of their crimes that I think makes them so chilling.
It's almost like they're living this double life, right?
Right.
Like on the surface, they might seem perfectly normal, but
Exactly.
then underneath, there's this whole dark,
Yes.
twisted world that they keep hidden.
That's often fueled by fantasy.
Really?
This paper dives into how fantasy plays a crucial role in the development and the execution of serial murders.
Huh?
It's almost like the killer is living in this world of increasingly elaborate and violent imagining
Yeah.
until they feel compelled to bring it to life.
That's disturbing to think about.
It is.
So their internal world becomes so distorted, so detached from reality
Yeah.
that murder becomes the only way for them to satisfy these urges.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
A gradual descent. And to understand that descent even further, this paper classifies serial killers into 4 main types. You have visionary, you have power control, you have mission-oriented, and you have hedonistic.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that, these categories aren't always clear-cut.
Right.
You might have a killer who exhibits traits from multiple types,
Yeah.
making their motives even more complex and difficult to unravel.
Okay, so let's try to unpack these a little bit. So let's say we have a killer who believes that he's been commanded by God to rid the world of sinners.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be visionary?
It could be.
Okay.
Visionary killers are often driven by hallucinations or
Wow.
delusions.
Mm-hmm.
They might hear voices, see visions, and believe that they're acting under the influence of some higher power
Yeah.
or some external force.
So in their mind, they're not really even in control. They're
Oh,
just
yeah.
carrying out orders.
Exactly. They see themselves as instruments of destiny,
Yeah.
not the ones responsible for their actions.
Wow.
Sadashiv Sahu was a man who claimed that he had these strange urges to kill
Yeah.
and confessed to killing 22 men. And his case kind of exemplifies this type where
Yeah.
those internal voices and visions completely overtake his sense of reality.
That's terrifying.
It is.
Like they're living in a totally different world.
Right.
One that's governed by their own twisted logic.
Now contrast that with the power control type.
Huh?
These killers are all about dominance.
Mm-hmm.
They derive pleasure from exerting their will over others,
Yeah.
from the feeling of superiority that comes from having complete control over their victims.
And the paper brings up a good example with Chandra Kancha,
Yes.
the butcher of Delhi,
Yes.
who would humiliate and torture his victims before killing them.
Right.
I mean, that seems to fit that profile perfectly.
Absolutely. A textbook example of the power control type.
Yeah.
The act of killing itself was secondary to the feeling of control that it gave him.
Yeah.
It's a chilling thought, But for these individuals, the victim is merely an object
Right.
to be manipulated, dominated, and ultimately discarded.
Okay, so we've got the visionary driven by delusions.
We've got the power control motivated by dominance.
Mm-hmm.
What about the other two types? What makes them tick?
Well, with the mission-oriented killers, they believe they're on a crusade of sorts.
Okay.
Like they need to rid the world of a certain type of person.
Yeah.
They might target prostitutes, thinking they're cleaning up the streets, or homeless people thinking that they're somehow bettering society.
So like a really twisted sense of justice?
Exactly.
Like they believe they're doing something good,
Yeah.
even though what they're doing is horrible.
They lack empathy for their victims, and they see them as less than human, almost like obstacles that need to be eliminated.
The paper mentions Chandrakant Cha again, this time targeting migrants in Delhi.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be mission-oriented?
Absolutely. And there are other cases that the research brings up as well. Raman Raghav, who preyed on slum dwellers.
Wow.
And then there's Darbar Singh, who specifically targeted and murdered non-Punjabi children. These cases are disturbing illustrations of how a warped sense of purpose can drive someone to do these unthinkable acts.
It's so hard to imagine how someone could justify taking another person's life like that.
It is.
But then there's that fourth type, the hedonistic killer.
Right.
They're not driven by some kind of higher purpose or delusion.
The hedonistic type, it's all about pleasure.
Okay.
They get gratification from the act of killing itself.
Okay.
But then even within this category, there's a further distinction.
Okay.
You have lust killers and you have thrill killers.
Okay, so lust killers, I'm guessing it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
All about sexual gratification.
Exactly.
Okay.
The Nasari Khan case, where children were allegedly captured for pornographic videos and even cannibalism, is just a horrifying illustration of that category.
Oh my God.
It's a dark and disturbing example of how deviant sexual desires can get tied in with violence and murder.
And then what about thrill killers?
So thrill killers, they're all about the adrenaline rush, the excitement of the kill.
So like they get off on the act itself.
Exactly. And the research actually mentions this case about a teenager who was inspired by the film KGF, who murdered security guards, seemingly just to become famous.
Wow.
It's terrifying to see how that pursuit of excitement and fame can become so distorted that it leads to violence.
It's almost like they're trying to make their life into a movie.
Right.
But the reality is they're leaving behind just total devastation and heartbreak.
And that's why, understanding these patterns, these motivations is so crucial.
Yeah.
It's not just about catching these people after they've committed a crime, but
Yeah.
it's about recognizing the warning signs,
Yeah.
the red flags that might indicate that someone is heading down a very dangerous path.
So what are some of those red flags then? Like, what should we be looking out for?
Well, the research outlines a bunch of common traits and thought processes that many serial killers share. They might be incredibly smooth-talking and charming.
Yeah.
Like Chandrakant Cha was known to be manipulative.
Yeah.
And he could easily gain the trust of his victims.
It's like the whole wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
They lure you in and then they strike.
But it's not always just outward appearances.
Okay.
They often have this grandiose sense of self, like they believe they're superior to everyone else. Remember how Jaha taunted the police?
Yeah.
He was leaving notes. He was daring them to catch him.
Wow. It's like they almost want to get caught. Like they need the attention.
Right.
Like validate what they're doing.
And perhaps even more chilling, they just lack empathy.
Yeah.
Remorse guilt. The research mentions Amarjit Sada, who committed his first murders at 8 years old,
Yeah.
showed absolutely no remorse.
Gosh, that's what makes these cases so hard to wrap your head around, right?
It is.
It's that complete lack of something that we as humans just consider to be so fundamental.
Yeah, it's like they're missing a piece of their humanity,
Yeah.
the piece that lets them connect with other people on an emotional level.
So how does all this information, these disturbing details, like how does this actually help us in the real world?
Well, the paper goes on to profile a bunch of other notorious Indian serial killers.
Okay.
It gives us this peek into the dark underbelly of society. And these real-life cases really show us the different types that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And they highlight the often complex and chilling motivations behind these crimes.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those cases then. What are some of the ones that really stuck out to you?
Well, the one in Kerala, the human sacrifice case, that one was particularly gruesome. I mean, the details are really hard to stomach. But the perpetrator not only murdered his victims, but he also engaged in cannibalism.
Yeah, it's a level of depravity that's hard to even wrap your head around, the idea of consuming another human being. it's so taboo, so
Yeah.
outside the bounds of, normal behavior, that it really highlights the extreme deviance we're dealing with when it comes to serial killers.
Then there's Cyanide Mohan, who preyed on women who were looking for marriage.
He promised them a better life and then poisoned them with cyanide to steal their jewelry.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how a serial killer can exploit trust and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
He used this guise of romance
Yeah.
and the promise of a future to manipulate his victims. And what's so striking about that case, I think, is that it shows us how seemingly ordinary people
Right.
can have these dark intentions.
Yeah. It's a reminder that evil can wear many masks.
It can.
Speaking of unexpected faces of evil, the research also mentions Cyanide Malika,
Mm-hmm.
India's first convicted female serial killer.
That's right. Her case really challenged that stereotype of the male serial killer.
Right.
She also used cyanide to poison women that she befriended at temples.
Really?
And her motives are still a bit of a mystery, but some people think that maybe she was driven by jealousy or a desire for revenge.
Yeah, these cases are really painting this picture of the diverse nature of serial killings in India.
Mm-hmm.
We've got killers driven by religious delusions, a thirst for power,
Mm-hmm.
a twisted sense of justice, and even those seeking sexual gratification or thrills.
And it's important to remember that these are just a few examples. The research paper goes into many more cases.
Yeah.
Each one offering this unique look into the dark side of human nature.
So after going through all of these cases and all these different motivations, these disturbing patterns, what's the takeaway? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, the research concludes that understanding these patterns, these motivations, is absolutely key for both law enforcement and public awareness.
Okay.
The more we know about what drives these individuals,
Mm.
the better equipped we are to prevent future tragedies.
Well, it's not just about catching them after they've struck,
Right.
but it's about being proactive, about recognizing the warning signs,
Exactly.
and potentially intervening before it's too late.
And it's about fostering a society that prioritizes mental health, that addresses inequality, and that provides support for those who are struggling. The research doesn't draw a direct causal link, but it really highlights the need to examine how societal factors might play a role in shaping criminal behavior.
So as a society, we need to take a good, hard look at the systems that might be contributing to these problems,
Absolutely.
the environments that might be breeding grounds for this kind of violence.
Yes. And on a more individual level, we all have a responsibility to be vigilant,
Yeah.
to be aware of our surroundings, and to trust our instincts.
Mm-hmm.
If something feels off,
Yeah.
if someone's behavior is setting off alarm bells in your head, don't hesitate to take precautions, to seek help, to report it to the authorities.
It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge, with awareness,
Exactly.
with the courage to speak up to protect ourselves and each other.
Yeah, knowledge is power, but it's also a responsibility.
That's a great point. We
I
can't
thought-
just bury our heads in the sand and pretend like these things don't happen.
Right.
We have to be informed. We have to be aware.
Yes.
And we have to be willing to act.
I agree. Understanding the darkness is often the first step towards creating a brighter world.
Well, I think that's a powerful message to end on this. It's been a fascinating, albeit disturbing look into the world of serial killers in India.
Mm-hmm.
It's a world that most of us would probably rather not think about,
Right.
but it's a reality that we can't ignore.
We can't.
And by shedding light on these dark corners of human behavior, we can hopefully work towards a future where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to happen.
I agree.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive.